Hi everybody, welcome back. Today's tutorial is focusing specifically on the way that we can begin to deconstruct the play to build our understanding of a character. Now, the whole purpose of this stage of your preparation is that you are building your own understanding of the way the character is put together and beginning to evaluate the choices made by Shakespeare to position you as a reader. Okay, so by now you have probably finished a reading of the play. You have, I very much hope, read something like a study guide. So you know what other people see as the most important parts in Shakespeare's characterization of someone like Macbeth or Lady Macbeth. And that's great. But the next step is very much you forming your own understanding of the characters and beginning to find little bits of evidence from the text that helps you to be able to justify why you see them the way that you see them. So in order to be able to do this, we need to have already understood that the way that a play is put together means that what happens in Act 1 is going to be manipulated in Act 2. So we see a change in power or we see a change in values. That what happens in Act 3 is ultimately the climactic point as far as emotional tension, and the decisions made by a character, by the protagonist in that particular act will have direct consequences for the outcome of the play. But that doesn't mean that the play is over and that there is still something that could happen to the character in Act 4, quite significantly, before their story is ultimately resolved or ended in Act 5. So we're not just thinking about characters as a little pocket of information that doesn't connect to anything else. We're thinking about the way a character is built across the course of a play, the way the character is built using the aesthetic features of language, the way a character is built so that an audience is positioned to see them in a certain way. Okay, so that means pulling a few different things together. Okay, so in order to help you to create your own process and to create your own response, I have prepared both a character map and then a sample character analysis of Macbeth using the dramatic structure of a tragedy template that I showed you in the Anatomy of a Play. So let's have a look at what it is that we need to know in order to be able to start our analysis of the character. So here is my character map. So this is really simple. And if I was creating something like this, I would probably actually do it on a big A3 sheet of paper so that I had plenty of room to move and I had plenty of space to add extra details. So this is very much a mud map of the characters. And the way that you create this needs to make sense to you. So I'm a graphic planner and graphic thinker, so I like to be able to lie my information out on a page. I often work across the page so I don't use the lines accidentally to drive my thinking. So that's why I always turn my page side on. I try and actually use where information is on the page to suggest something. So normally it's about hierarchy in something like a character map. I create a key for different kinds of relationship so that I can keep it all in black and white, although certainly I could have highlighted this or written names in different colors and have achieved the same effect. And in what is currently white space, I will eventually be able to add some details as far as the implications of one character's actions on other characters so that I build a really detailed understanding of the interconnectedness, okay, the interplay of characters with other characters. Okay, so in this particular mind map or mud map here, you can see that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are central. So you know they are not the highest ranking characters at the start of the play. We're aware of this, but they are the title, well, Macbeth is the title character, so it makes sense that he's going in the middle. I've connected him to Lady Macbeth with a solid line. That's normally the established practice for demonstrating a marriage or a family connection. So it makes sense that they're there. And obviously there's a lot of work to be done around Lady Macbeth, but right now this is just working it out for ourselves, building out a map that gets us started. I've got a different connection the dotted line there for Banquo, and that tells us that while it's a strong relationship, while it's a significant relationship, the fact that we've even included it, it's a different relationship. So this one could be friend, it could be brother, it could be enemy, but in our case, it's friend. And then you can see the solid line to Fleance because that's his son. Of equal rank, but not connected by a familial connection, are the Macduffs. So they're over here, they're ranked the same. We've included them, but we know that the way that they are relevant to the story plays out in a different thing that has nothing to do with a family tree. So they're just added here for the time being, and we're going to explore that later on. And then over this side, of course, we have King Duncan, who you can see actually sits higher on the page because he's our highest ranking character at the start, his two children. And then just because we know that there are other characters who are significant, but who aren't necessarily of equal rank or of equal social standing, we've included them elsewhere. Now, I've created a little list of witches, ghosts, and murderers and connected them directly to Macbeth. By the little asterisks, and that's telling us there's a different kind of relationship there, or the fact that there's a relationship there at all is probably a really relevant point, given that he's supposed to be the king and he's consorting with witches and murderers. We know that that's something that we're going to have to tease out. And just because there are a lot of names that you're unfamiliar with, and perhaps ranks that you're not used to either, I've also, using the information that's just in our shared version of the play, given each of the characters their title by region. Okay, so Thane of Fife, Thane of Lochaber, Glamis, Cawdor, and eventually the king. Malcolm is the Prince of Northumberland. So all of those are titles that are given, and sometimes it's important when we hear a character referred to one time by their name and then another time by their title, it's important to know who's who in the zoo and where they actually fit together. I could go one step further. I could also add where they live, whose castle is at Inverness and who is at Scone, and where things are happening, because that also helps to build our contextual understanding. And you'll notice, of course, there's probably one key character who's not connected there. Oh, there's a group of characters not connected, but one key one, and that's someone like the porter. So underneath the Macbeth household, I could also have had a collection of servants, gentlewomen who waited on Lady Macbeth, doctors, and someone like the porter, who all play a part in the story but aren't necessarily significant in something like a character tree. All right, so we'll stop that one. So first thing I need to know is where all the characters fit in relation to each other. You've probably already drawn that on the board in your class already, but it's worth doing it yourself so that it makes sense to you how characters connect, the relative ages of them. The very fact that there are people like Banquo and Duncan who are recorded as having children, but with no reference to wives. So we can safely assume that all of those boys have mums, but they're not relevant to the story. Okay, so they could now be widowers. Their mothers could still exist, but they're just not part of the story. Thinking about who's included and who's not included just helps you to get your head around what happens to those characters when Macbeth starts to make decisions. Okay, so then you might remember that I shared this particular little document with you. So this comes from the Sydney Theatre Company education arm, and this actually teases out the Freytag pyramid of dramatic structure with a little box for you to write information in relevant to each of the 5 parts of the play. So the exposition, the rising action, and then on the second page, the climax, falling action, and denouement. So this one, there's a link to this particular document in the information for Anatomy of a Play, and I will also attach it in the information for this particular tutorial. So what I did then is I used that particular template to begin to build my contextual understanding of the character of Macbeth. All right. And because I don't actually expect you to see it while I'm holding it up, I'm going to show you an example that I've prepared. Now, I want to stress, this is my version of the character analysis. This is not the only version, and this is by no means complete. It's really just a worked demonstration of what needs to go into character analysis so that you're understanding the impact of change, the impact of decisions, the impact of relationships as a character progresses through the story. So let's have a look at that. Are looking at my annotated version of the dramatic structure of a tragedy, specifically for character analysis of Macbeth. Okay, and you're going to see that there are two lots of highlighting used across my document. So as I found individual quotes that were relevant to the point I was trying to make, I've included those and I've highlighted them in green. Now, in order to prepare for my external exam, I'm going to take that one step further, and I'm going to actually be able to say that words like brave Macbeth came from Act 1, Scene 2. I'm going to know where each of those comes from, because that's going to be relevant to me demonstrating that I understand that the character changes from that point on or whatever. Okay, so I have broken my analysis of the character into each of the 5 sections that are included on that template. And I've gone through and I've highlighted what I see, or I've identified what I see as something central to the characterization of Macbeth from that particular part of the play. So Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, Act 4, Act 5, and where I've also found a literary device or an aesthetic feature that is particularly relevant, I've highlighted that in orange. So you can see here that in Act 1, where the focus is providing an introduction to all of the characters, perhaps to the key complication, and beginning to establish the story, I need to establish the status quo. So at this point, Macbeth is a loyal soldier. He is depicted as brave. He is violent and bloody, yes, but in the context of the battlefield. That's really important. He's still seen as someone who is fundamentally a good Christian. He's still seen as someone who's fundamentally a good Scotsman, and he's still seen as someone who's fundamentally a good gentleman, you know, in terms of the aristocracy. So in Act 1, it is appropriate to use the language of chivalry to describe Macbeth, because certainly he shows hospitality, he shows courage, he shows generosity, he shows loyalty, and is rewarded for it. It is important, however, and I should have highlighted this, but I've underlined it, that when, despite all of that happens, so the battle takes place, the rewards are coming regardless of what happens in the interaction with the witches. It is the interaction with the witches and then also the involvement of Lady Macbeth that helps to reveal Macbeth's hamartia. Okay, so the violence and the bravery was already there. When manipulated by the witches, what we see is the vaulting ambition. And that's teased out for us across the course of particularly Act 1, 2, and 3. Macbeth is driven by a desire to succeed without necessarily doing the hard work or facing the judgment of others, judgment that others would give him based on what he chooses to do to succeed. Okay, so he wants the prize without the hard work. So it's important that we see that identified in Act 1, because that's going to drive the whole rest of the play. And we see that the influence of Lady Macbeth as a character, when she is aware of that, she knows that Macbeth has a couple of flaws. He's too full of the milk of human kindness to take the quickest way. So he's not prepared to actually do the hard stuff that could be done to secure these titles and ranks. And so she manipulates that by specifically devaluing him as a man when he says we're not going to engage in killing the king. Okay. And she actually says he's more like an animal if he's not prepared to commit to the actions that the promises he made to her as her husband. And we see that through Act 1 and Act 2, that manipulation of him as a man, as someone who should be considered strong and brave and loyal and virile, is an easy kind of dig that Lady Macbeth can use to get him to do what she wants him to do. Okay, so key thing in Act 2 then is that we're looking for changes in reaction. So rising action, if you have a look at the little boxes at the top there, so the rising action, the conflict is introduced, something occurs that sets it in motion. Well, we know that has happened already with the witches offering these prophecies, and the rising action leads to the climax. So we know that we should see an increase in tension, and often the increase in tension, of course, comes from the fact that we are challenging the status quo. So you are going to look for changes in reaction, because these are driven by a change or a change in foregrounding of different values, attitudes, and beliefs. Okay, so in Act 2, we know that Macbeth has already sort of equivocated about whether he's going to kill the king, talking about the fact that he genuinely liked to have the success, but without actually doing the hard work or being seen by people. And so Macbeth quite often evokes the imagery of darkness to cover his actions, or blindness so that people don't see him doing bad things to get a good outcome. He'd just like to be seen as the good guy. And I've identified there in Act 2 that literary device that I mentioned in my previous tutorial of pathetic fallacy. So the importance of pathetic fallacy for us in Act 2 of this play is that it's highlighting just how awful this crime is. So we know that we're not even at the climax of the story yet, but the heinous nature of killing the king has so subverted the natural order of the world that the physical manifestation of evil is the horses biting each other and the eclipse and chimneys falling down. So the pathetic fallacy is the real world having all of these things going wrong, which as an audience member tells us that the thing that caused all of that to happen, Macbeth's decisions, are also wrong. Okay, so then if I look on to my second page, then I've played out the same level of detail for the rest of the play. So in Act 3, we know that the actions of Macbeth will lead directly to his final downfall, which comes in Act 5. But when I say actions, I'm thinking about things like decisions, the alliances that he's now building and the ones that he's letting go, and the secrets that he's keeping. So alliances and secrets kind of go hand in hand for Macbeth in Act 3. And we can think about what that might mean for him as a character. So, of course, we have both the planning of Banquo's murder and Banquo's murder. A point that I find really interesting, there's two things I find really interesting in Act 3, is that Macbeth compares his relationship to Banquo as similar to Mark Antony's for Julius Caesar. So it's actually evoking that idea of stabbing your friend in the back before it actually happens. So it's an allusion to something else that we needed to know, but it's also foreshadowing what's going to happen. And the other thing that I find really interesting is that the ghost doesn't appear to Macbeth until after the murderer says that Fleance has actually lived. Okay, so we know that Macbeth went into that banquet expecting Banquo to die. So he doesn't see the ghost because he's feeling guilty. He's not seeing the ghost because he's second guessing himself. He saw the ghost because the actions that he's taken, the decision that he can't go back on now, killing his best friend, hasn't actually netted the security that he was looking for. He's still, his rule is still just as precarious as it was before because Fleance is still alive. I just think that's such an important little detail, because we could often think that the seeing of a ghost is associated with guilt. And in his case, it's more the fact that he's just so insecure that he's not prepared to let fate take its course, or the story to play out. He wants to force it to happen on his terms. And as I've mentioned with my class, Macduff is noticeably absent from the feast. And that's important because when I say noticeably absent, Macbeth notices that Macduff is absent. And that is going to drive what happens in Act 4. And then that is going to drive what happens in Act 5. Okay, so then in Act 4, we're looking for the ways that he tries to prevent his downfall. And so often we see this in the characterisation of stories, that after things have started to go wrong, we scrabble to try and make decisions to circumvent the worst possible outcome, and often it actually brings it about. So what does Macbeth do specifically? Well, he engages witches in another set of prophecies. And these should, we know, provide him with the security that he wants. And instead, what they really do is augment his arrogance and his hubris about his untouchability, which makes him more tyrannical than if he'd perhaps just tried to be a good king. So Macduff's family is killed. So when we're told to beware Macduff, Macduff's family is killed. And rather than this actually stopping or quelling Macduff's rebellion, because we know he's gone to England to try and get Malcolm to come home, what it does instead is it actually spurs him on. So he's the one who comes back to fight then. And in Act 4, we see a number of really negative descriptors used by Malcolm and Macduff for Macbeth. And that's important because it's showing that real change in characterisation from the chivalrous character we saw in Act 1. And of course, we juxtapose then the characterisation of Macbeth against the way that Malcolm describes a rightful king in Act 4, Scene 3, in which he lists all of the criteria of chivalry, none of which fit for Macbeth by this point. And then finally, in Act 5, everything comes undone. We see our three prophecies play out again, as we would expect, but we also see the nadir of Macbeth's characterisation. So nadir is the lowest point. When Lady Macbeth dies, he doesn't care. She should have died hereafter. He gives us his out brief candle monologue, which really highlights the shortness, the maybe pointlessness of human life, likening man to an actor who struts and frets his hour upon the stage and is heard no more. So there's no legacy to the actions of the average man. And then finally, Macduff beheads Macbeth, which is a lovely bit of paralleling back to Act 1, when Macbeth was the one who was doing the beheading, and we end the reign of the dead butcher and his fiend-like queen. Okay, now I've included that, even though, of course, those are Malcolm's words and not Macbeth's. It's relevant to see that from the brave Macbeth at the beginning, we've now referred to this man as a dead butcher married to someone who is akin to a demon. Okay, and so being able to identify those aspects so that if someone asked me a question about Macbeth, I'd be able to talk quite flexibly about it. That is the whole point of this process. Okay, so I'm going to put the blank template of this wonderful chart into the descriptor of this tutorial. My recommendation would be that you would try and do one of those summaries for each of the main characters. At a minimum, I would say Macbeth, Lady Macbeth, Banquo, I would think, and Macduff. If you put Duncan and Malcolm together on one, that would be fine, because certainly they work symbolically as symbols of chivalry, but knowing that helps us then to analyse other characters more deeply. Okay, so best of luck with your analysis of characters this week. I will also share this completed one in the descriptor so that you can see what I did and where I went, and I look forward to seeing your work. As is always the case, if there's anything that you would like to see in a tutorial, please let me know either in the comments below or simply by emailing me. But until next time, see you later.